All right, as we often say, God is great. Proverbs 17, let's call this one the sauce. Less is more. Going back to a piece of advice I got from a mentor once who said, since we were in the talking business, it can be easy to use too many words to try to get our point across. So he said, there are times, Marcus, when you have to realize that less is more. A bit of advice that stuck with me and reminded me of the theme that the proverb writer seems to be getting across in this chapter, where at least 14 of the 28 proverbs seem to suggest that there are times when we can benefit by understanding that less is more. Those 14 seem to fall into three categories, beginning in verse 1, where it seems to help us understand the times where our money or resources can help us understand the ways in which less can be more. Likewise, verse 2 will show us the ways in which our character can sometimes benefit from understanding that less is sometimes more. And then finally, because so many of the Proverbs are devoted to wisdom, likewise, the wisdom verses in this chapter seem to help us understand times in which less can actually be more. Beginning with the money passages, as we said in verse 1, it will start out by saying, better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. Verse 5 will say, whoever mocks the poor insults his maker. He who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. As verse 8 will say, a bribe is like a magic stone in the eyes of the one who gives it. Wherever he turns, he prospers. However, verse 23, speaking more about the bribe, will say, the wicked accepts a bribe in secret to pervert the ways of justice. Understanding that there are cultures where in order to simply get justice, you have to give a little bit extra. That can be considered a bribe. But the bribe that he is talking about here is the one in which money or a little bit extra or literally a bribe can be used to gain advantage and pervert justice, reminding us of the number of times these proverbs, going back even to the Psalms, talks about the way in which the Lord laughs at the wicked. This proverb seems to remind us that there may be, once again, a grace period where a bribe seems to make life so much easier. However, to the degree we use it to gain unfair advantage, like the ways of the rest of the wicked, God has that on the clock. Likewise, it's going to go on to say in verse 18, the one who lacks sense gives a pledge and puts up security in the presence of his neighbor, reminding us once again that sometimes we need to be careful in situations where we want to help financially, but we might not know as much about the situation as we need to. Less is sometimes more in the times in which we would like to help out, but we really don't know all that we need to know about what is going on. Likewise, though, we said that verse 2 marks the ways in which character can sometimes benefit by understanding that less is more, where verse 2 will say, a servant who deals wisely will rule over a son who acts shamefully. Skipping over the second half of the verse for time's sake, verse 6 will say, grandchildren are the crown of the aged, and the glory of children is their father. Understanding that there are times when we can be preoccupied about the accumulation of money that we can store up for our later years. That is super important, but I don't think it means as much if you do not have the accumulation that it speaks of here. The fact that even if you don't have a whole lot of money, to the degree that you have raised honorable children, that carries a wealth of its own. Verse 13 going on to say, if anyone returns evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. And finally, verse 26 going on to say, to impose a fine on a righteous man is not good, nor to strike the noble for their uprightness. Those last two proverbs, 13 and 26, reminding us that sometimes less is more in the approach that we take to those who are engaged in righteous or just causes. Understanding that if we do too much, we can find ourselves attracting the judgment of God in the days in which he comes to the aid of those in need, especially those who are in need for righteous purposes. And finally, the wisdom passages remind us that in verse 9, whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends. Verse 10 telling us that a rebuke goes deeper into a man of understanding than 100 blows into a fool. Verse 14 will let us know that the beginning of strife is like the letting out of water, so quit before the quarrel breaks out. As verse 24 will help us understand that, the discerning sets his face toward wisdom, but the eyes of a fool are on the ends of the earth. As the end of the chapter, verse 28, will help us to realize as well that even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. The last verse of the chapter reminds us that even a foolish person is considered wise when they can put a lid on their lips. How much more, to the degree that God has given us wisdom, are we considered capable when we understand when to speak and how much to say? Going back to that concept of quitting before a quarrel breaks out. A lot of times, if we can simply measure our words and actually replace them with healthy actions, sometimes we might find that we can avoid conflict in situations where it might have seemed inevitable.